Hi, Philippe.
Hi.
Hi, good morning. You've been
Good morning.
officially introduced. So we have the crowd here for you. You can start anytime you want.
Okay. Now, I just have 15 minutes, so this is going to be a very brief presentation. And if you're eager to learn more about what I'm talking about, I did write a book about this. It took me 10 years, and you can read it in less than 10 hours for sure. So anyway, it's called Only One Chance. Now, this first slide shows you the human brain, how it develops from the very beginning and then through to the time of birth. And you will see that it starts like a tiny little part of a sausage, and then it expands, and clearly a lot of stuff is happening to create that incredibly complex organ. Of course, other organisms have brains, but the human brain is the very most complex in the animal kingdom. So the next slide, that's slide 2. Uh, it shows you the various very sensitive stages of brain development that we all have to undergo. And the point is that if we don't complete a particular developmental process the right way and at the right time and the right sequence, we can't go back and do it over. There is only one chance. And you can see from my notes on this slide that there are some highly complex processes that have to be completed. For example, the nerve cells have to be in a particular place, and they're not born there. They have to move, and some of them move like 1,000 times their own size, and some of them end up in columns, and so they get some neighbors that they can communicate with, and all processes are so complex we don't quite understand how they happen. But the crucial consequence of this is that makes our brain very, very vulnerable, because these processes are sensitive, and anything that goes wrong will have substantial consequences for the functioning of the brain, because the functions rely on the integrated brain, that all of the contributions from the different parts of the brain are ready to cooperate on, whatever functions that we rely on. Let me then move on to say something about the chemicals on slide 3. What we have seen with a compound like lead, that's the one on the top right, what we've seen is that it started out with us learning from occupational health that lead was toxic to the brain. And later on, there were some poisoning events that involved children, and we then saw that they were more vulnerable than adults. And with time, we realized that, hey, this can happen even at the lowest concentrations. And so lead has completed this path from, occupational health with, fairly a small number of people involved, and also at relatively high doses. We now realize that I would say most children in the world are affected to some degree. We really talk about millions and millions of children. Methylmercury, that's the next one on the right-hand side, has followed that very same path, as has PCB, and there are some other chemicals on their way up. There are more solvents coming, pesticides, food contaminants like PBDEs, and all of this suggests to me that we really don't want to see those compounds completing that path and becoming part of the silent pandemic, as Phil Landrigan and I call it. We want to stop that. And this can, of course, only happen through better prevention programs and, of course, some more research. The fourth slide shows you the iceberg situation. There's a tiny little white triangle at the very top that represents the currently, the most recent paper we published says 12, but I'd say we're up to 14 now of substances where we believe we have ample proof that they contribute to the chemical brain drain, as I call it, in humans. And then there are more than 200 additional chemicals where we know they're toxic to the human brain, but that has only been demonstrated in adults, from poisoning events, etc. And I would say all of those are very likely chemical brain drainers. They're probably even more toxic to brains during the early development. And then you can see that there's at least 1,000 industrial chemicals that are toxic to animals. And in this number, I don't include drugs and natural toxins. So in addition to us realizing that there's an increasing number of chemicals involved in the chemical brain drain, it's also a matter of dose. So the next slide shows you what has happened over time in regard to lead. In 1960, when CDC for the first time decided on a safe level for the blood lead concentration, you can see it was very high. It was 60 micrograms per 100 ml or per deciliter of blood. And in a working group I participated in for the European Commission in 2000, that was earlier than that, but a few years ago, we had to conclude we just don't know what the safe level is. It's so low we can't really define it at this point. And so you can see that the research conducted during recent years has pushed safe level down. And this, I believe, will also happen to many other chemicals. So if we're trying to identify the overall patterns, what's really going on here, then slide 6, we now realize that we have been very optimistic. And for example, when I went to medical school, and I realize it's a few years ago, but anyway, when I went to medical school, we were told that the placenta would protect the fetus. That's why there was a placenta. But it is no armor, and it was not generated in order to protect the next generation against modern industrial chemicals. It was not. And likewise, we had the belief that brain development was something that was genetically predetermined. Not so. It's affected by a variety of environmental factors. The pharmacologists tell us, well, if you just take the body weight into account, you are okay. Well, that's not the whole story. And likewise, we thought from our clinical experience that, any adverse effects would be reversible. But if they happen during early development, the effects are not reversible. And then we have the untested chemicals assumption, namely, if you don't know anything, that chemical is safe. It is so naive, and it's actually dangerous. But this is how we operate nowadays. You've got to prove that. Let me just focus on the last two issues, namely the naive belief that if we don't know anything about the chemicals, they're safe. But this is what regulatory agencies, think. This is what they have to rely on. And the last one that says that science must settle and can settle all uncertainties. Well, science can't settle every uncertainty. There will always be some left. And I think all of this calls for what the Europeans call the precautionary principle. And we have to figure that in our thinking and in our planning for better prevention and better protection of the next generation's brains. So let me move to slide 7. It has to do with the way we should think about prevention of chemical exposures. I call it the 3 T's. The toxic effects are determined by, first of all, like Paracelsus said 500 years ago, the toxicant dose. The dose is, of course, very, very important. But the second thing is that the target organ is crucial. We haven't thought enough about this. And what we have seen is that the brain is uniquely vulnerable. And it's simply because its development is so complex that it is tremendously vulnerable. All of these little tiny developmental processes that have to happen at the right time and the right sequence makes the brain very, very vulnerable. And at the same time, for our brains to function well, we need to have an optimal development so that the integrated parts of the brain can work together. You can live a perfect life with just one kidney, but I don't think that you would like having chopped off 5 or 10 IQ points that we know some of these chemicals can do. Because your life would be very, very different if you have had, a very much lower IQ. You would, for example, not participate in the Children's Environmental Health Summit now if we had a tremendous number of IQ points. Your quality of life would be horrible, and so we've actually done some calculations. Because the value of an IQ point is worth something like, $15,000 or so in terms of lifetime, taxable income. So well-functioning brains are crucial to society. There is an article in the Lancet that was just released, I think it was yesterday, about the fact that a good start in life will determine your quality of life, and I think the message that the Lancet is trying to tell us is that in regard to poverty, the crucial thing for a large part of the world is that we make sure that the next generation are a lot smarter than we are, because we have, at least my generation, has created a lot of problems, and we need really intelligent people to clean up after us. So that's my slide. It's like a vicious circle that we have to break to make sure that we can prosper in the future and not making problems that we already see even greater. So I was told I should not speak for very long, so this is just a brief summary, and I'm sorry I can't be in Anchorage right now. I've been to Alaska a few times. I'm a bird watcher, so I'd love to visit your state, but it will have to be some other time.
Well, thank you.
What is different in Europe that they are able to pass laws that are more restrictive on chemicals, and we're not able to do that in the U.S.?
The gentleman in the audience is asking, what is different in Europe? What's happening different there? That the laws are more protective there than in the U.S.
Okay. I would say that in Europe, at least we have the pesticides regulation, biocides regulation, and we have REACH in regard to general industrial chemicals. But the problem is that we're not testing industrial chemicals nor pesticides for developmental neurotoxicity. The best they do is to determine the weight of the brain of newborn pups, newborn rat babies. And, measuring the weight of the brain is not a very good indicator of the functions of the brain. And also what can be seen as neurotoxic to a rat brain probably has to be a substantial dose, because the rat brain is not very complex compared to ours. So I would say currently we have a very strong need for proper testing, especially of pesticides that are meant to be toxic to the nervous system of pests, because I don't want to embarrass you, but the neurochemistry that you have between your ears is not very different from what cockroaches and rats have. But I'm sorry, but of course we use the neurochemistry in different ways, and that is exactly my point. And this is why the animal testing may not be sufficient, at least not the way we currently do it, and certainly not just determining the brain weight. That's kind of naive. So maybe Europe is a little bit ahead of America, but not very much.
Thank you. One more.
I wanted to know what the relationship was between the toxicity of lead. How's that relate to the toxicity of mercury in terms of reduction in IQ?
Okay, Philippe, you heard that? Or?
No, please repeat.
Okay, so what you're asking is that the relationship of lead exposure, the effects, and mercury, and how it relates to the reduction of IQ in children.
Okay. We think that based on the dose-response relationships, that lead in America is a lot greater problem than mercury. There are actually relatively few women who during pregnancy are highly exposed to mercury. It may be different in Alaska, but certainly lead exposures in old residential buildings, that is an ongoing problem. It may come from water pipes, as we've seen a lot of places lately. It may come from old peeling paint. I think the annual cost to society from lead exposure may very well be in the order of billions and billions of dollars, and mercury may be a few billion, maybe something like 5. So mercury is a less problem. We have done a little bit of. Anyway, I think I completed my response. So lead and mercury are perhaps additive, perhaps slightly less than additive.